Case study, adding incentive hooks to your next performance-based contract. So 1 week before a performance-based contract was supposed to be executed, a client senior executive asked my coaching client to add some more hooks to the performance-based contract. So what exactly did that senior executive mean by a hook? I'll answer that question in just a moment. And yes, the supplier did agree to the changes. Hey, I'm Jeanette Neiden, a contract attorney. I train contract professionals, usually non-lawyers, to negotiate complex commercial contracts with confidence. I'm the author of 4 books all about negotiating complex contracts and the owner of the contract negotiation skills training company, Neiden on Negotiation. Be sure to check out the earlier case studies too. In my case study analysis today on incentives, I will describe how one client is using a custom-built scorecard to locate the right metric to incentivize a supplier. Now, if you want to learn how to build a custom scorecard, which is super helpful to develop incentives, watch this case study video on YouTube. Performance-based contracts. These are a class of agreements where payment for goods and services is contingent on the supplier achieving clearly outlined performance goals or desired outcomes. Typically, performance-based contracts contain the 5 following critical components: a performance work statement or a performance-based statement of work, a quality assurance surveillance plan, performance-based metrics, contractual incentives or disincentives, and 5, the right type of pricing model. Let's focus on the 4th element, and that's incentives. All of my advice is as applicable to service as well as manufacturing contracts. All right, so why include incentives? Incentives motivate both parties to make decisions that will meet relationship goals by balancing the economics of the performance between the supplier and the customers. Incentives provide financial and non-financial benefits to both parties to offset economic flaws in most pricing mechanisms like a fixed price or time and materials. Now, there are 4 types of incentives to use in your performance-based contracts. Let's talk about each one, and then I'll give you a little bit of advice about how to build that into your scorecard. The first incentive is the most obvious: reduced costs. Customers incentivize suppliers to better manage costs in the delivery of goods and services. Typically, a customer and a supplier will gain share those savings when actual project costs come in lower as compared against the budgeted estimate. Not all contracts and not all industries can do that, but that's an example. The second is performance. Now, these can be very effective, but they require a very complete statement of work and a service level agreement, or a key performance indicator, KPI. A performance incentive is tied to a quantitative target, such as completing a phase of the project before a deadline, or it can be qualitative, such as beating a customer satisfaction target in a help desk contract. Now, the third is an award. This is an incentive for a one-time, one-off type of contract to meet a one-time goal. So as opposed to SLAs that endure for the life of the project, not just the life of the contract, an award incentive is appropriate for a shorter term agreement. So at the end of that agreement, when the supplier meets that one-time goal, the supplier will get a financial bonus. Now, these are helpful when the nature of the work makes it challenging for the parties to set a predetermined SLA at the time of contract execution. Now, the 4th is additional contract duration. Now, these incentives are often overlooked as an incentive. They are very powerful, though. This incentive is invoked when a customer chooses to extend a supplier's contract for another year or 2 when a supplier demonstrably meets or exceeds a performance target. Now, this is different than having some sort of an automatic evergreen clause where a customer or a supplier can roll over the contract for another year. This is a choice that is made based on performance. Now, this incentive reduces transaction costs to both the customer and the supplier by tying contract duration to performance, not just to one party's convenience. Now, in my last case study, I discussed how one client developed a custom scorecard, and I described the 5 steps we used. In step 4, we had a workshop, it was online through Teams, to develop a spreadsheet of metrics. One of the areas of discussion was performance expectation with respect to each metric. Some metrics have very little tolerance. That means that the supplier must meet a performance target, and if they don't reach that target, the customer will suffer some sort of financial loss. Security is a great example of a situation where a supplier must meet a very stringent threshold. Now, in that case, it's best to determine if the loss is so great the supplier should pay liquidated damages. On the other hand, if the customer is striving for extraordinary performance, it is wise to consider establishing a stretch goal. A stretch goal means the supplier will exceed current known expectations for that service or for that product. Improving help desk answer responsiveness is a great example. If the customer is experiencing lower than average internal help desk responsiveness times, let's pretend it's more than a minute to answer a chat, the new outsourcing supplier, who's now going to be answering chats, can establish a benchmark for performance at 1 minute to answer a chat. The threshold for poor performance is greater than 1 minute, and the threshold for exceptional performance is less than a minute. That exceptional performance metric would be eligible for a financial bonus or incentive. But there's a trick. The trick is to balance the supplier's desire for exceptional performance to answer chats in less than a minute against other types of performance to make sure the supplier does not cut corners in one area to get a bonus just to create challenges in other areas for the customer. So this is what I mean. The nature of the problem at this fictional help desk is that the time it takes to respond to a chat, according to the customer, is too long. And the customer wants to incentivize the outsourced supplier to answer help desk chats in less than a minute. But the customer has to be sure the supplier is actually answering help chat inquiries. If the incentives are not just right, the outsourcing supplier can open 25 help desk chats to meet the 1 minute metric and get their bonus, and not resolve any of those help desk chats within, let's say, a 5-minute time frame. So the supplier is creating a backlog of technicalities and open issue resolutions, but it's making its bonus. So it's not actually meeting the intent that the customer has. So that's the trick. That's what we want to consider when we develop a custom scorecard and try and tie incentives to that scorecard. So here are some drafting tips. 1, understand the overarching business objective and don't get too focused. So if we were super focused on this fictional 1 minute to answer a chat, we would lose the perspective that it's not just answering the chat in a minute that's important, it's answering the problem within a certain definitive time frame. That's the problem, and there's a couple different ways to go at it. Answering chats quickly, but also resolving the chat or moving the chat for technical resolution with somebody else is also a very big part of answering help desk inquiries. 2, you want to identify any industry-wide performance standards to benchmark. Be careful though, because for example, I work to support a nuclear power plant. So the standards within that industry are going to be very different from some other industries such as retail. So you want to make sure that you understand not just the industry of help desks, but you understand the industry of help desks within maybe a sub-industry, because retail chat's going to be different than the kind of help desk chat that you would see at a nuclear power plant. You want to benchmark your own customers' actions, and if you're able to, ask for supporting data from the supplier in its efforts in a similar industry. Third, you want to identify the allowable deviation in the tolerance that is appropriate for your business. The negative deviation might be eligible for liquidated damages. Then fourth and finally, all areas where performance can exceed current levels, create those stretch goals, those may be eligible for a bonus. And one more thing, customers. If the parties contractually agree to incentive payments, then you, the customer, must be financially able to pay the bonus if the supplier meets the stretch goal. I have seen too often customers agree to a financial incentive payment and then not be willing to pay the supplier when that supplier clearly demonstrates exceptional performance. Not only is that a lack of payment disingenuous on the customer's part, customers are not going to get exceptional performance for free. Suppliers will find a way to bake in charges for that exceptional performance that are not transparent to the customer. And is that what you want as a customer, that lack of transparency? Well, if you're intrigued to learn more, stay tuned. Next month, I'm going to talk about the fifth and final element of a performance-based contract, developing a pricing model. And I will again draw on my experience that one of my clients is having in developing a pricing model. If you'd like your own copy of the Contract Professionals Playbook, you can find a copy on Amazon for purchase.